I don't know if you know, but I grew up playing soccer ever since I was a little boy. And I played all the way up until college. And in soccer in particular, as being the sport that I'm most familiar with and had experience with, I remember that every time we were away from the team for a season, or for a time, when we returned back for the season, we'd always begin the first few practices with the fundamentals. And that was whether you just started the sport or you played in college, even in the most successful teams professionally, they always begin with the basics. You start with conditioning and dribbling, right? With ball control and passing. That's how the most successful teams operate. And even in golf, it's similar. You have the great golf, legends, who every time they're away from the sport for a while, they begin with the basics. I think Lent, in many ways, is similar. Lent is a time when we go back to the basics. So, as beginners and pros in the faith, every year we come back to camp with Lent in order to work on the fundamentals, so to overcome the obstacles that work as stumbling blocks in our path to holiness. So what are some of those struggles that we endure, that we're faced with often through our Lenten journey? And how do we overcome them? I think the answer is clearly seen in our gospel. So in our gospel, we're presented with this familiar scene, right? Jesus is in the desert and he's tempted by the devil. In our gospel, we're presented with Jesus as being inundated with temptation. He's led there by the Spirit, but then he's in the desert, and the desert represents a space where all is void, right? You're kind of detached from the things that make you comfortable, that give you pleasure, the simple, basic things. And I think our journey in many ways in Lent is very, very similar. We go back to the basics, strip away the excess in order to confront the difficulties that we often ignore throughout the rest of the year. So what happens to Jesus in the gospel, it also happens to us. So in our scene, Jesus, he's tempted in 3 ways. And each time he's tempted, he employs a different weapon to fight that temptation. And I think that's what's really useful for us as we continue on our Lenten journey. So in the first scene, the first temptation, the devil says to Jesus, he says, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." If you are the Son of God. I mean, Jesus is hungry, right? He's been in the desert for a long time, 40 days totally. I mean, I'm hungry after 40 minutes. I can't imagine what it was like for him to have fasted and been tempted. Even before the devil enters the scene, if you've ever been in the desert for an extended period of time, you can imagine after a while, hunger and thirst begins to kick in, and the desert begins to play tricks on you. You start seeing things. And I imagine Jesus, as he was walking his way through the desert, would have seen those Judean stones, and he would have been tempted to think that they look like loaves of bread. And so now the devil enters in and says, "Go ahead. Just turn those stones into bread. Satisfy your hunger." So what's the first great temptation? I think it's this. It's the temptation to focus our life on material things and on the satisfaction of our desire. I think everyone struggles with that. We're so focused in on material things, the things that bring us base pleasure. The great spiritual author Thomas Merton, he likened our bodies and our sensual desires, which are good in them themselves, by the way. Food is good because you need it to survive, right? Comfort is good to a certain extent. So the desires for food, comfort, and pleasure are good in and of themselves. But they can run amok in our lives. They become, he says, like little children because they're so insistent. And we know how children could be, right? They want what they want when they want it. Now. No, Mom, I can't wait. I'm hungry. Or no, I need this or I need that. After a while, the more we give in to our pleasures, our desires, that's what they do. And then the next thing we know, they're running the house. And everything is upside down because we've given control over to our desires. And our desires are they're so fickle because we know when we give in, it doesn't last long. The thing is, Jesus shows us, though, with this temptation, what weapon we can employ to combat it. And so, he shows us fasting. You know, our fasting that we participate in over these 40 days, they help us to see that man and woman do not live on bread alone. Fasting helps us to see that we need more than just food, drink, comfort, and pleasure in our lives. With fasting, we better understand that the things of the world cannot ultimately satiate the hunger that we have in our hearts. The second temptation. So the second temptation, we hear how the devil took Jesus up and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world in one instant. Imagine what that must have been like. That's like enjoying all of ice cream at the same time if you're a big ice cream fan. Like, not over time, but the great feeling in an instant. It's overwhelming, right? Seeing all the beautiful nations and palaces, etc., at that time that were associated with power in an instant is more of a temptation than gradually being exposed to it. So there was a lot of pressure on Jesus. The devil goes deeper with this tactic and he ups the ante. So the devil, what he's doing is he's tempting Jesus with power. Right? Isn't it true, friends, that in our lives, the desire to wield power is one of the strongest temptations that we're faced with? Oftentimes, in fact, the difficulty that we experience in resisting forgiveness, for example, is more times than not associated with power. Our inability to forgive is really a way to exercise our power when we are powerless. So what's striking about this temptation in the gospel is that the devil admits that he can give all the kingdoms to Jesus because they all belong to him. I mean, what a staggering observation, isn't it? What a judgment on the powers of the world. The devil, in a sense, has them all. What's scary about this temptation is that if you make power the center of your life, you lose your soul. Why? Because our relationship with God in the spiritual life, it's all about surrendering to God's power. If you're in contention or in a battle with God over who has power, you're going to lose every time. You become your own God. So in the spiritual life, it's all about allowing God to dominate us, not the other way around. And we're not allowing a tyrant to dominate us, but a loving God who wishes the best for us. When you make your domination of others paramount in this life, you lose your soul. So, friends, the discipline of prayer is the weapon that we employ to combat this temptation. It helps us to ward it off because in prayer, what happens in prayer is we realize that we don't have as much power and control as we often think we do. We realize that I don't have the control over my life and what happens as I often convince myself of having. And prayer, it helps us to be okay with that, with allowing God to be in control, because we know He has our backs. And then finally, we have the third temptation. So we hear that the devil takes Jesus to Jerusalem and he sets him up at the parapet of the temple, so the highest point of the temple. And he says to them, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself from here." And he says that the angels will catch you. You have nothing to fear. I think it's important to note why the devil chose this location. He chose it because the temple was the center of social life for the Jew at the time. The temple, everything in your life revolved around the temple. That's why it was so devastating for a leper or someone caught in public sin or a sinner, any sinner really, a public sinner, because it separated you from your ability to worship in the temple, meaning that you were not involved in society. You were outcast, segregated, because the temple was the center. So the devil takes him here and he takes him to the highest point. He takes him to the highest point of the temple. So the temptation here isn't so much for power, although that's a part of it. The real temptation here is honor. Being seen and admired by everyone. The temptation here is the desire to want to become the center of attention, to become recognized and admired by others, and in fact, to find your value in what other people think or say about you. See, the last temptation, friends, is ego. During Lent, we're asked to deploy the discipline of almsgiving to combat this temptation. So what does it do? Well, almsgiving, it helps us to realize that we're not the most important person in the world. And that in fact, others need attention and love and compassion and assistance. Almsgiving helps us to acknowledge that we also have a responsibility to others, that they are important, and they certainly are important to God. So friends, 40 days is a long journey indeed. And along the way, we will find a ton of obstacles and stumbling blocks that will bring us down. But how will you defend yourself? Well, today Jesus gives us tips. And maybe these are tips that we should definitely appropriate in our lives. What are you doing for fasting? What are you doing for prayer? And what are we doing for almsgiving? So as you begin your journey, get back to the basics so that you can stay on track as you make your way to Easter.